What's going on there, guys? Today we're going to be converting The Screen by Edvard Munch into this 3D animation, all from using Photomotion parallax. We're going to be separating out our layers into Photoshop, and then we'll use parallax within After Effects to bring this surreal picture to life. So let's get to it. First, we're going to want to open our image in Photoshop, and once we're there, we want to crop our image in ever so slightly using the square marquee tool in order to get rid of these worn edges within the image. We're also going to want to get rid of this beam here just to make our lives a little bit easier and keep our viewers focused on the person here. Cool, so obviously we can't be working on our background layer, so let's duplicate it now, and we're going to use the polygonal lasso tool in order to fill in these last couple of edges here using content aware fill. Once your selection is made, click on fill and just copy our settings over here. And there we go, let's get to the meaty part of the tutorial and start making our layers. Go to the quick selection tool on the toolbar just over here, and let's get started on masking out this person just over here. No need to be too precise, we'll correct this in a bit. So of course, go over to select and mask over here, and once you're done, let's finite these edges around this person. We'll want to be quite precise with this, so take your time, and if it takes a little bit longer, then so be it, as this will be our first layer and therefore will stick out above the rest. So once we're happy, let's change our output layer over here to mask with layer and then hit OK. Cool, so that's our first layer done, and what we want to do now is make sure that our selection within this mask is actually selected and then disable the first layer because we don't really need it for now. Then we're going to expand our selection by going over to select, modify and expand. We'll set the amount here roughly around about 20 pixels. Then right click on the selection and just hit fill to bring up the fill menu, and just like when we used the lasso tool earlier, again it's very much the exact same settings. Okay, great, that's our person here taken care of, but obviously content aware is hardly infallible, so let's correct some of these imperfections using the patch tool just over here. Now, to be fair, content aware has done the majority of the work for us. We just need to rebuild parts of this image which it's gotten slightly wrong. However, we're going to really need to work on this bridge just a little bit more, so let's be a little bit more surgical, and we're going to use the square marquee tool to our advantage. This time we're going to focus on the area of the bridge that really isn't aligned at all. Then we're going to go to edit, transform and finally warp, and then we're going to tweak it so we can just get everything in line. Of course, we have been left with these prevalent edges within our image, so let's use the patch tool to sort them out. An unfortunate byproduct, we now have this section over here where our person from the background is showing through, and that's because our background layer is still visible, so we won't be able to use the patch tool here. So let's make sure that we've got layer 1 selected and use the clone stamp tool instead to fill in that area. And once we're done, we can get back to removing these parts which don't look so great. We can also disable and enable our layers just to check for inconsistencies, and again, once you spot something, feel free to correct it and be as thorough as you need to be. Don't forget, you can still use content aware on these smaller sections, which might do the trick if you're struggling to nail something down. Also, don't forget you can expand this image out a little. Feel free to elaborate on parts of the environment, like say for example this river here, if you think it will play well within your animation. Let's make our fixes look a little bit more a part of the scene by using the spot healing brush and applying at these spots over here. So with the delicate part of this tutorial over, let's get to masking out our second layer by using the quick selection tool. We're also going to use the polygonal lasso tool to finite our selection and remove these areas in between the bridge and the background. Obviously, we want to make sure that only the bridge is selected within this area, so be precise as possible. And of course, once we're done, let's go to select and mask. Right, so it might be a little bit harder to do this part as it's going to be slightly more difficult to tell where your edges begin and end, and surrealist images may do that, unfortunately. So do the best you can and take your time, ensuring to carefully review your work as you go along. Once you're finished, again we're going to change the output to new layer with mask, and once we're there, let's go back to the main screen, enable layer 1, click on our mask and disable layer 2, and then repeat what we did earlier. Let's expand our mask and this time set it to about 30 pixels, and once again we're going to use the content aware tool within this image to provide data on what exactly is behind this bridge. So we've now got to fix a few imperfections here before we do anything else, but no need to go overboard as this is the clean plate, of course. If you're unsure, just think about sorting out what can be seen and then just do a little bit extra. You can of course use a variety of different tools for this, so do what you feel is best within the circumstance. We're also just going to change the names of our layers just over here so that when we do get into After Effects, we're not going to run into any confusion. And of course, that's the most difficult part of the tutorial over. Now, of course, we're going to need to save it, so let's just place it in an area where there's not much file traffic, say for example the desktop. Of course, the next thing that we need to do is get to the latest version of Parallax and just double click on this Start Parallax button, and once we're at the main dashboard, there's nothing you can really do but just hit Add Background over here. So once we're inside our background composition, let's just import our Photoshop project into After Effects and make sure that our import kind is set to composition. We of course don't want to merge our layers back together after all. So click on OK and your Photoshop file is now within your project. First, let's import our clean plate into our composition and parent it to this null layer up here while holding Shift. Cool. So we'll need to scale our image into our composition by using said null layer down here. And once we're happy, let's go back to the main dashboard and change our aspect ratio by clicking on the resolution button and then going over to effect controls. We'll then change our aspect ratio to portrait and our export resolution to 4K. Right, a quick note, this won't change your actual preview resolution, so you won't have to worry about stuttery playback if you do choose to export out as 4K. So we've ran into a bit of a problem. As you can see, our image is now scaled too small and we're seeing these black bars on the side. It is an easy fix, of course, so let's go back into the background layer and scale it up a tad. And once we're done, let's go back to the main dashboard and we can start adding in our other layers using these buttons here. Remember, when importing our layers, we don't actually need to scale them all again, just simply parent them to the null layer while holding Shift and all the attributes will be copied, and that's as simple as it needs to be. So once we're done, let's go back to the main dashboard and start the more creative part of our project, setting up our animation. First, take your time, head to the desired mark, in our case it's to the 6-second point, and then add some zoom by clicking this magnifying glass on the controller and then going to effect controls just over here. Finally, let's move our animation direction by dragging the controller in any direction, and if you're happy, just hit N on your keyboard to mark the end of the workspace. Cool, so this is the animation so far. Let's change its color ever so slightly by going over to color on the main dashboard and just tweaking these curves here. Right, so now that we're happy with that, let's get to adding some particles in. Click on the settings panel just over here and then click on the checkbox Activate Particles and slide this particle type to something like 22, and let's work our way down. Okay, well, these ones look okay. Let's see how they work within our animation. Yeah, this will do. Now, of course, we have the full power of After Effects here, so there are other things that we can do to our animation to make it just slightly more dynamic. So inside layer 2, the one that we put the bridge in, let's bring our playhead to the very beginning and add some twirling to it by just adding some puppet points to the layer. Right, so now that we're happy with our puppet points, let's move our playhead and match the last couple of keyframes within our main dashboard and then hit mark out. Remember, our animation was roughly around about 6 seconds long, but you may have decided to do differently. Make sure just to double check if you have. Right, so now that our playhead is in place, let's move our puppet points and create some movement. Now, also what we can do here is apply a warp effect and make this movement seem even more surreal. Now, of course, we don't want this arch sort of look, so feel free to change it to twist and then set the blend just over here to 0, while also making sure to click the stopwatch icon over here to make sure it's animating, making sure that our playhead is at the very beginning of our animation now. Next, let's move our playhead back to the 6 seconds mark, and then let's set the bend to something like around about 30ish just to give this nice wavy impression. So let's do the same with our background, so over to background layer, and again, while making sure that our needle is at the very beginning of our composition, select the puppet points tool and place all of these points around our layer. With our background, just make sure that all the edges are covered with points before moving anything, otherwise you might unintentionally ruin the look that you're going for. Excellent. Like before, bring your needle to the 6-second point and drag these puppet points around your animation. A friendly reminder though, let's try not to go too overboard with these movements, as you'll want these movements to be as subtle as possible as not to draw attention away from your main animation. Much like last time, we're going to use the warp effect just over here. Again, we'll change this to twist and we'll animate this twist across our timeline so it just has a little bit of surreal movement to it. Excellent. So let's see how it looks within our overall animation. Not bad. Let's add a little bit of movement with this person here. So let's jump to layer 1 here and then use the puppet tool and add only a couple of points here, then move the playhead to the 6-second mark, and then let's add some small amount of movement to all these points here. So if we go back to the beginning, we can exaggerate this movement even further by closing up the face and the mouth here as much as possible. Cool, so once we're happy, let's go back to the main dashboard and further animate out our background. So if we click on the background button just over here and then move our playhead to the beginning of our composition, we can then animate some extra scale to our background by clicking on the stopwatch, then moving our playhead to the very end of our animation, and then finally adding some scale using the same slide. We'll also animate some coloring by adding some contrast and shifting the reds within the background. So let's go back to layer 1 and do the same by clicking on the stopwatch icon on curves and then moving our playhead to the very end of our animation, and then we can add either some contrast or some light, whatever we really feel like. Cool, so it's looking great so far. Let's get some depth of field in there by doing exactly the same. So let's go to the animation button just over here and then move the depth of field slider to something like 5, then click the stopwatch icon, and then we can move our playhead back to the beginning and then set this back to 0, and that will animate in seamlessly across our animation. Of course, as proven, you can do this with a variety of different effects. It's exactly the same principle. So with everything that's in place now, let's export our animation by obviously clicking the export button just over here. So our needle is already on the 6-second mark, which is the end of our animation. So all we need to do is just hit N over here, and that will cut it all off. That way we won't be rendering out countless amounts of loops. So we can actually still animate in some lens distortion by clicking on the settings button over here and then going over to this lens distortion. Just make sure that your time hit is at the very end for your work path before starting this. And then go back to the very beginning of the composition and then set this slider all the way back, of course. Awesome, so let's add some vignetting by doing exactly the same, clicking on the stopwatch here and then moving our playhead to the very end of our animation and setting it to around 41-ish. Let's preview it out now. Quite nice. And finally, now that we're happy with our animation, let's go to composition just over here and then click on add to render queue. Let's just make sure it's not rendering out to something like AVI and change this format to QuickTime so it renders out as a MOV. And then hit OK. And nothing left to do now but just hit the render button over here, and that's our animation rendered. So there we are. Our animation is now complete. I hope you've learned something new today, and please feel free to share your animations with us. Until next time.